All right, welcome back to class. This is Introduction to Political Ideas. I'm Ken Hicks. We are exploring the wild and wacky world of socialist ideology. We're going to be talking today a little bit about how socialism evolved following the death of Karl Marx in 1883. Pictured on this slide is Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian Marxist who was imprisoned when he was 35 in 1926 and spent the remainder of his life in prison in fascist Italy. While in prison, he wrote what were known as the prison notebooks, which are considered to be some of the most original contributions to 20th century Marxist theory. His principal contribution to socialism is the idea of cultural hegemony, which builds on Marx's idea about the ideological superstructure, arguing that the bourgeoisie dominates the cultural values and norms to such an extent that they become unquestioned common sense. Gramsci would differ from other orthodox Marxists in advocating for the construction of a working class counter-ideology for the proletariat to achieve revolutionary class consciousness. So what are we going to learn today? We're going to have a brief introduction. We're going to talk a little bit about Marxism after Marx, that period where you have basically Friedrich Engels kind of editing Marx in oftentimes creative ways. We're going to talk about the revisionists, and then we're going to talk a little bit, we're going to begin our discussion of Soviet Marxist Leninism. One thing that we'll talk about, again, I want to emphasize a point. It's frequently argued among socialists that, and we'll talk about this over the course of this presentation, that future, that Marxists and people who spoke claim themselves to be Marxists oftentimes diverged significantly from Marx's thought. It doesn't necessarily mean that if they had been absolutely loyal and interpreted Marx accurately, that socialism would have somehow turned out to be a benign force in the 20th century. I think it's fairly clear that even had Marx lived to 90 years old and become a leader of a Marx, of a socialist country, the likelihood is there would have been a heck of a lot of violence and terror and a lot of dead people, because the revolutionary Marxist project involved fundamentally a small group of people, asserting for themselves an entitled position in society and telling everyone else that they fundamentally have to change their ways. And that's a recipe for authoritarianism, for coercion, and for a lot of deaths. And I say this about other ideologies as well. But this is, to me, it's not some weird thing that, if we'd just taken Marx seriously, somehow the horrors of the 20th century wouldn't have occurred. They might not have been quite so bad. They still, I think, would have resulted in lots and lots of horrible things. So a lot of people consider this period from the death of Marx in 1883 until around the start of World War I as a golden age of socialism. There was an enormous amount of intense political and theoretical ferment in that period. You have the emergence of rival interpretations of socialism, compared to Marxism, and you have emerging alternative interpretations of Marx's writings themselves. So socialists of all stripes generally found themselves having to come to terms in some way with Marx. And if you look on this slide, this is Friedrich Engels as a young man, probably in the period from 1840 to 1845, which was around the time he first met Karl Marx, with whom he had previously exchanged letters. Engels was a scion of a wealthy Prussian family, and he used his wealth to support Marx while Marx was in exile in England. Following Marx's death in 1883, Engels worked to edit Marx's magnum opus, which was Das Kapital, and became the principal authority on Marxist philosophy. But critics suggest that his interpretations of Marx were oftentimes dogmatic and missed many of Marx's more nuanced thoughts. So if you look at this slide, it really kind of shows you a schematic, just the major kind of manifestations of socialist thought. Of course, you have the early socialists like St. Thomas More and some of the commune-based utopians, and you have Marx and the emergence of Marxism. And then you have, again, a schism, which nobody should be surprised here. You see lots and lots of different divisions within every ideology between those revolutionary Marxists like Vladimir Lenin, who we'll learn more about soon, and then revisionists like Edward Bernstein. And then you have later emendations of revolutionary Marxism in the form of Stalinism and Maoism, and then Trotskyism, which also develops a pretty loyal following in places like in India and in Peru. And then on the other side, you have folks that do not express any fidelity to Karl Marx. And those include the anarcho-communists like Mikhail Bakunin and the French Proudhonists and folks like that in Blanqui. Then you have the Fabian socialists, who were the British socialists. There is a Christian version of socialism, and then there is sort of a market version of socialism, which bears some resemblance to libertarian thought. So Marx after Marxism, again, while Marx detested the uses to which his philosophy was being put during his lifetime, many others sought to deploy his philosophy for ideological purposes. If you look closely at this slide, this picture was taken, this was a picture of Marx in 1882. He was 63 years old then and would die within the year. For comparison's sake, I'm a year younger than Marx was that year. So, I mean, what you see is a man who is not well. He suffered from liver ailments. He suffered from boils, from skin lesions that gave him tremendous pain. He rarely was comfortable for about the last decade of his life. Part of that is because he liked to eat rich food whenever he could get access to it. He liked caviar and things like that. It's really the stuff that's really not good for your liver. He also smoked and drank heavily. And because he rarely had money, he was frequently smoking bad cigars and drinking, rather adulterated forms of alcohol that you would find in the 19th century. So, in a letter to his son-in-law Paul Lafargue, Marx expressed distress over the claims of French socialists who were describing themselves as Marxists. And again, Marx himself, who never really felt as though his philosophy was fully understood by the French socialists, wrote, "One thing is certain is that I am not a Marxist." And during his lifetime, he preferred the designation scientific socialist. And I closed class, asking you, why the label Marxism became so popular. And in part, it's because it was easy to tie up all the defects of socialism within the framework of one person. To demonize that person is thereby to taint and demonize the whole system of thought itself. So Engels' version of Marxism was unique. Engels himself was, as I said, a reluctant capitalist. He was born into a family that owned several very large factories. He was sent to Manchester to run a factory. Engels was known to be a bit of a sybarite. He loved the good life. He routinely had paramours. He routinely contracted with prostitutes for sex. In 1845, he came into contact with a young Irish factory worker who, kind of showed him the underside of English factory life, and he wrote a treatise called The Condition of the English Working Class, which chronicled the horrific working conditions of working class folks in England. And Marx came into contact with that work, and it impressed him. And he corresponded with Engels and subsequently met with Engels in Paris. And they became very, very close friends. They were a bit of an odd couple. Marx was a radical philosopher, somewhat of an ascetic. He was also a family man. He was married. He had numerous children, numerous female children. He had a son that died very young. He took his family life fairly seriously, although he did have, by all accounts, a relationship outside of marriage that resulted in a child. Engels was, again, a wealthy capitalist. He liked to go to plays. He loved music. Again, he was he liked to have salons where he would entertain people, and they would drink and smoke cigars late into the evening. Nevertheless, Marx and Engels had very complementary talents. Marx was clearly the deeper thinker. He was much more steeped in continental philosophy than was Engels. But he was an indifferent writer. He tended to be prolix. He tended to, like many Germans, if you've read Hegel or any of the other of the seemingly great German writers, they had a tendency to just splatter words on the page. Sentences would last for entire pages. Engels was a much better writer. He was kind of trained in more of a journalistic frame of writing. And again, Engels was very good at rendering Marx's very complex thought as in more simple terms that would appeal to popular readers. Marx relied on Engels' patronage during his exile, and he spent much of his adult life outside of Germany. He was hounded by the German secret police for most of his life. They hounded him from Prussia to Paris, then from Paris to Cologne in parts of, it was sort of a Catholic part of what was then Germany after the Franco-Prussian War, and then subsequently he was forced out into England, where he spent the remainder of his life. And so while the theories, concepts, and ideas were Marx's, the prose was often Engels. And again, while Marx was living and while he was able-bodied and sound-minded, that partnership worked fairly well. So to what extent is Engels the inventor of Marxism as we understand it? It's important to note, following Marx's death, Engels began to embellish on Marx's theories. He had exclusive access to all of Marx's writings, all of his notebooks. In some instances, Marx's rewrites involved radical reinterpretations of Marx's ideas. Revolutionary socialists like Vladimir Lenin and later on Mao Zedong would oftentimes be reading Marx through the prism of Engels' reinterpreted versions of Marx. And again, if you look at this picture, this is Engels in 1891, 4 years prior to his death in 1895 of throat cancer. And again, most of Marx's available work in the late 19th century were publications extensively edited and oftentimes rewritten by Engels. And so the later part of the 19th century was really a unique political environment. You're only one decade into the establishment of the German state. The German Empire was formed in 1871 following Prussia's decisive victories over Denmark, Austria, and France in subsequent wars. Germany subsequently became embroiled in a Kulturkampf, which was a German word for culture struggle, with the Catholic Church for control of the educational and ecclesiastical jobs related to what we now describe as the administrative state. If you look at this slide, you'll see a guy named Wilhelm Liebknecht, who was radicalized during his university studies in Berlin and Marburg. He spent a decade in exile in England, where he befriended Karl Marx. He returned to England in 1862, or returned in Germany in 1862, where he joined the General German Workers' Association, which was at the time led by Ferdinand Lassalle, who was a rival of Marx. Later in the 1860s, he left the ADAF to form the Social Democratic Workers' Party. And at various points in his life, Liebknecht worked and served in the German Reichstag, which was the lower house of the German parliament. So Marx was an advisor, a close advisor to what was then the Social Democratic Workers' Party in the 1870s. He subsequently, kind of helped form the Social Democratic Party, which is one of the first and largest of the social democratic parties. So Marx enjoyed considerable influence with the leadership of the Social Democratic Workers' Party leadership, which included people like Liebknecht and August Bebel and Edward Bernstein. And so ultimately the formation of the German Social Democratic Party, again, is bringing to fruition Marx's ideas about consciousness raising. He believed that that was an essential part of the proletariat coming to the realization that capitalism simply would never work for them, that capitalism was always a rigged game, according to Marx. And so originally the Social Democratic Party was an alliance between the Social Democratic Workers' Party, the SDAP, and the General German Workers' Association, the ADF, which again was led by Lassalle, this person I mentioned earlier, who wanted he was an advocate for workers, but he also was a nationalist. And so he was inspired a great deal, and again, the Social Democrats really didn't like that, especially Marx. But the alliance between the two parties helped, was furthered by the establishment of what was known as the Goethe program, the Gotha program of 1875. And that document, and again, by 1875, Marx's health is already not very good. That document so infuriated Marx that he, again, denunciated it as one of the last kind of systemic writings that he did, which became known as the Critique of the Gotha program in 1875. And he declared the whole program, for all its democratic clang, is tainted through and through by the Lassallean sect's servile belief in the state, or what is not better, by democratic belief in miracles, or rather it is a compromise between these two kinds of beliefs in miracles, both equally remote from socialism. So you get the sense of the extent to which Marx really didn't like that development, that alliance, which in one way, you would look at Marx and say, well, an alliance of workers would be good because that would suggest a convergence of worker interests. But the problem for Marx was that these other guys were wielding more influence within the Socialist Party, and that compromise was something that he had difficulty swallowing. And so this earlier rivalry really emerged in the 1860s between Marx and this guy, Ferdinand Lassalle. And again, as noted on the previous slide, Lassalle was a committed nationalist. If he'd come along a couple of generations later, he probably would have ended up being a fascist of sorts. We can talk about that next week when we get on to fascism. But he believed in supporting the newly constituted German Empire. So in contrast with Marx's commitment to internationalism, or the idea that the workers had more in common with workers of other nations than with their respective states, Lassalle believed that workers would need to employ different tactics to achieve workers' goals in different states. And so where Marx would basically say, the state is just a reification. The workers are all that matters. Lassalle would say, well, the reality is that the conditions in Germany are different than the conditions in France or Spain or Italy or Austria. And so we have to be tactically, pragmatic. So Lassalle rejected the idea that the state would wither away. He also argued that workers would need to seize the state peaceably and democratically, which again is something that was sort of anathema to Marx, but it would become something that later Marxists would warm up to. So Marx and Lassalle engaged in a vigorous debate over the course of the 1860s. Lassalle was prematurely, he died prematurely. I shouldn't say he died. He was killed in a duel between another gentleman over a woman. He was a noted Lothario. And so it should also be noted that following Marx's death, Engels became the principal advisor to the Social Democratic Party. And again, It should be noted that during this period of the Kulturkampf, which was this conflict right at the start of the formation of the German state in the 1870s, that the German state largely behaved in ways calculated to inculcate loyalty the loyalty of German workers to the state. But in the aftermath of the Kulturkampf, the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who blamed 2 attempted assassination attempts on Kaiser Wilhelm I, forced through the anti-socialist laws in 1878, which was the express aim was to suppress the Social Democratic Party and banned SDP organizations, meetings, and newspapers. By the time the law sunset in 1890, over 1,500 German socialists and suspected socialists had been imprisoned. And the German anti-socialist laws contributed to the growing militancy of the SDP, which later formed, it splintered at one point, forming the Communist Party of Germany, the KDP, which was far more radical and far more committed to the violent overthrow of the German state. So what were some of the ways that Engels' revisions, were kind of unique? In Engels' eulogy of Marx, he eulogized Marx as a man of science. And again, by science, Marx meant a body of organized knowledge amenable to testing as to its veracity. So scientific knowledge was not unchangeable, but rather is subject to questioning, revision, and refutation. Marx himself had been highly critical of the classical economists for being insufficiently scientific, and likewise he criticized the young Hegelians for the same reasons. And so while Marx could be highly sensitive to criticism from those with whom he differed, he was capable of introspection and self-critique. So Marx fundamentally viewed science in a rigorous and scientific way. Engels' view of science tended towards a more closeted form of dogmatism. People who basically are saying, how dare you question my findings? I am a scientist. That is sort of the attitude that Engels, evinced, this sense in which this is a scientific conclusion. It cannot be subject to question. So Engels seized on Marx's Hegelian dialectics to sort of offer this philosophical proof of the perfect and invariant nature of Marxist laws. Marx never said anything was law-like, really. So in the end, Engels is transmogrifying Marx's commitment to science and changing it into something that we might call scientific socialism, which again is far more dogmatic, logically closed, full of tautologies. Another aspect of his revisionism is how Marx, he kind of changed Marx's views of and basic approach to what we might call materialism. So when you look at the within the framework of Hegelian philosophy, Hegel himself was an idealist. He was basically arguing that humanity was trapped within a world of ideas and there was no way of escaping that. Marx would famously turn Hegel on his head and say that the world revolves around the material bases for survival, what humanity has to do to organize itself in order to survive. So Marx had a contempt for the crude materialism of folks like Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes was one of the first modern philosophers, would argue that the world and everything in it consists of nothing but physical matter. Marx likewise ridiculed the crude materialism of some of the young Hegelians in a series of notes called Theses on Feuerbach. These were 11 numbered notes written in 1845 as pointed criticisms of the materialism of the young Hegelians. And among those young Hegelians was Ludwig Feuerbach, who is pictured on this slide. And he wrote a book called The Essence of Christianity, which definitely exerted considerable influence over Marx's turn from Hegelian idealism to materialism. But the notes were intended as a chapter for the first chapter of his book, which would be called The German Ideology. And the third note reads, "The materialist doctrine that men are products of circumstances and upbringing, and that therefore changed men are products of other circumstances and changed upbringing, forgets that it is men that change circumstances, and that the educator himself needs educating. It's a subtle point, but it's an important one. And again, it's reflects the idea between a subtle and careful analyst in Marx versus a much more crude and dogmatic thinker in Engels. So, an important group of people emerge after Marx's death, and really after Engels' death in 1895. And these are, some of the revisionists, and some of these folks actually predate a little bit. But again, around the turn of the century, some Marxists began advocating a fundamental re-examination of some central aspects of Marxism. One important group were the Fabians, and they reflected again the preference for evolution over a revolution in British political culture. They believed in kind of slow change rather than radical change. And so pictured on this slide is one of the important, more famous Fabians, George Bernard Shaw, who was kind of a socialist, a later member of the Fabian Society. He wrote classic plays like The Arms and the Man, Pygmalion, and St. Joan. And so Fabian is one of these important kind of non-Marxist versions of socialism. And it was founded in 1884. The name was inspired by a Roman military figure whose surname was Cunctator, which is translated into the delayer. Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus was a Roman statesman and general during the Second Punic War. And he recognized that that the Romans simply could not defeat Hannibal in pitched battle. Hannibal was a tactically brilliant general. And so his strategy against Hannibal was to avoid engaging him directly in pitched battle, but to keep his troops in close contact with the Carthaginian army and to harass them with raids whenever targets of opportunity arose. And so Fabianism came to refer to a kind of cultural war of attrition, designed, again, to constantly press capitalism and press reforms upon capitalism. And so it represents a kind of nexus point, a mesh point between socialism on the one hand and liberalism on the other hand. There are a number of these Fabians whose writings really you could look at and say it's really hard to see a meaningful distinction between a Fabian socialist and a liberal, a welfare liberal. So, some of the calls that early Fabians called for was a minimum wage, universal health care, and the abolition of hereditary peerage. And so, if you want to understand the evolution of Fabian socialism, they become one of the founding organizations of the British Labour Party. Another important figure is also exists within Marxism, and this was Edward Bernstein, who was a very polarizing figure within German socialism. He was a founding member of the Social Democratic Workers' Party. Originally, this was a group known as Eisenachers for the town of Eisenach, which is in central Germany, which had a large Jewish population of which Bernstein was a member. Bernstein, like most socialists of his generation, spent considerable time in exile. Bernstein fled into exile as the result of the anti-socialist laws. He landed first in Switzerland, which was a bit of a gathering spot for especially German-speaking socialists in this period, German and Russian-speaking socialists, I should say. In 1888, Bernstein relocated to London, where he would stay for 13 years. For most of his exile, he was a loyal follower of Friedrich Engels until Engels' death. While in England, Bernstein met with members of the Fabian Society, whose evolutionary approach to socialism may have influenced his shift away from revolutionary socialism. But Bernstein himself denied that the Fabians had any influence and criticized the Fabians as visionless pragmatists. So Bernstein always counted himself as a Marxist in spirit, if not always in his beliefs. So one of the things that Bernstein argued was that Marxism is, in ignoring moral criticism, moral and ethical considerations, dismissing those kinds of considerations as mere ideological superstructure, that's problematical. Bernstein ultimately follows Kant, Immanuel Kant, in assigning to humans free will and to the view that individuals were ends unto themselves. So for Bernstein, such a Kantian moral perspective is still a damning one from a socialist view, because the bourgeoisie treat workers as merely an ends to a mean, the mean being profit. More concerning, Bernstein was concerned that socialists' focus on the end game of communism ignores how the means could undermine that end. That if you use immoral ends, it can taint everything that you achieve. So Bernstein's practical political socialism took a more step-by-step approach. Here again, Bernstein is arguing that near-term aims should be replaced in front of maximalist or endgame goals. And that kind of pragmatism infuriated the more doctrinaire Marxists. And one such critic was a Polish-German Marxist by the name of Rosa Luxemburg, who was pictured on this slide. She was one of the first European women to be awarded a doctorate, which she earned from the University of Zurich. In 1898, she engaged in a sustained debate with Bernstein over the direction of the Social Democratic Party, or arguing in a book, Social Reform or Revolution, published in 1899, that evolutionary socialism amounted to a betrayal of Marxist principles, and that dismantling Bernstein's economic arguments regarding the resilience of capitalism and the unreadiness of the proletariat to rule. So ultimately, in 1914, she split away from the Social Democratic Party and formed the Spartacist League, which would become the Communist Party of Germany. Luxemburg and her ally, Karl Liebknecht, led the Spartacist uprising in the closing days of World War I, which was brutally suppressed and resulted in Liebknecht's and Luxemburg's capture, torture, and execution by Freikorps, which they're called Freikorps. They were ultimately German mercenary soldiers hired by the German state. And so again, this is sort of, I'm previewing, history to come here. Additionally, Bernstein argues that there are political problems, that political developments following Marx's death run counter to his hypothesis regarding the evolution of capitalism. Again, pictured on this slide is again Otto von Bismarck, a conservative German statesman who served as German Chancellor of the German Empire from 1871 to 1890, and whose policies greatly influenced the fortunes of German workers in that period. As Prussian Chancellor prior to German unification, he worked with Ferdinand Lassalle of the General German Workers Association in 1863 and 1864 because of their shared mistrust of liberal political factions, and because Bismarck liked Lassalle's pro-German nationalism. Bismarck generally hoped to use favorable German policies towards workers to wean them away from the Social Democratic Workers' Party, again, over which Karl Marx and later Engels exerted considerable sway. Following the establishment of the German Empire, the two failed assassination attempts on the Kaiser, Bismarck passed this anti-socialist laws, which significantly worsened conditions for German workers, Bismarck continued, though, to try and improve German working conditions, passing extensive insurance laws guaranteeing access to health care and guaranteeing old age and disability insurance. So ultimately, Marx was largely responsible for creating many of the kind of nascent welfare things that so often vex conservatives today. But in the end, he failed because the Social Democratic Party continued to expand in popularity and membership over the course of, and especially after the anti-socialist laws got lifted. So the rapid spread of voting rights to workers was viewed with skepticism among Orthodox Marxists. But Bernstein looked at these things and said, this may be, an instance where Marx was wrong, and where the capitalist state or the authoritarian state, whichever one you want to call it, could prove more adaptable than what Marx imagined. Engels also criticized the Marxism on economic grounds. So if you look at this slide, the pictures of Friedrich Ebert, who was one of the more polarizing figures in European socialist politics of the early 20th century. He came from a working class family. He never got a college education. He read Marx and Engels' writing, but never became sort of what we might call a doctrinaire Marxist. He joined the Social Democratic Party in 1889 and was harassed by police, but wasn't considered to be important enough to merit arrest. Nevertheless, Edward Bernstein was a mentor of sorts to Ebert, and the two were ideologically and temperamentally aligned within the Social Democratic Party's factional politics. In 1912, he was elected to the Reichstag, very rapidly rose up through the SDP's leadership, and shortly after the death of August Bebel, became the leader of the Social Democratic Party. During the Spartacist uprising in the German Revolution, Ebert allied with the SDP with moderate and conservative factions to suppress the uprising and govern the country following the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm. As provisional president of the Weimar Republic, it was Ebert who signed the punitive Treaty of Versailles in 1919, which tainted the SDP in the eyes of most Germans. And gave impetus to the stab in the back rhetoric that contributed to the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany in the 1920s. And so for Bernstein, he's looking at all this and saying, well, the failure of this irreversible logic of capitalism to immiserate the workers is a problem. Real income of workers in Europe had consistently risen over the latter part of the 19th century. Bernstein attributed the improvement of conditions to workers' growing political voice and to its organizational strength. Bernstein dismissed the fears of revolutionary socialists that improving conditions were symptomatic of false consciousness. Bernstein's revisionism provoked a great deal of controversy within 1890s European socialist circles. So let's look a little bit closer at Bernstein's evolutionary socialism. So first and foremost, Bernstein spends a lot of time in his writings basically citing Marx. And it's important to keep in mind something that, when Engels died, he named Bernstein the executor of his literary estate. And that meant Bernstein had access to all the stuff, all of Marx that he may previously not have had access. So he starts by saying, no socialist capable of thinking dreams in England of an imminent victory for socialism by means of violent revolution. Socialists are increasingly relying on local governments to achieve, kind of smaller, more pragmatic goals. Socialists have abandoned their early contempt for trade unions. What are the aims of these non-revolutionary socialists, referring really to himself? And he's really saying, let's go back to Marx. Let's read him more carefully. The working classes have no fixed and perfect utopias to introduce by means of a vote of the nation. They have no ideals to realize. They have only to set at liberty the elements of the new society which have already been developed in the womb of the collapsing bourgeois society. Preconceived theories of how the movement will unfold must necessarily always pass into utopianism. So note the word that appears twice on this particular slide. In 19th century socialist thought, especially in Marxian thought, the idea of utopianism emerged as a go-to term of abuse. It was the attack that Marx would use to attack his socialist critics, particularly to the left of him, of fanciful utopian thinking, as if the pathway to communism would at no point require, kind of getting your hands dirty. So once again, he cites that Marx's preferred moniker of scientific socialism. He asked the question, am I opposed to scientific socialism? He's basically saying that the Marxist deterministic position on the hopelessness of the worker is disproved by Marx himself, right? Marx notes the dramatic improvements in the physical well-being and morale of English workers due to the enactment of the Factory Law in 1847. In the same book, we read that the society is no firm crystal, but an organism capable of change, that also an improvement that was unmistakable. Since 1866, the legislation dedicated to the improvement of the working conditions had been strengthened. And again, recall our discussion of Tory democracy from our presentations on conservatism, where welfarism in England helped dramatically improve workers' conditions because the Tories understood that if they didn't win working class voters, they would be doomed to becoming, a party without voters. So if to state such facts means that following the immortal Bastiat, he's talking about Frederick Bastiat, the kind of capitalist philosopher, French economist, then the first among the ranks of the followers is Karl Marx himself. So he notes that there are interpretive challenges inevitably with thought as complex as Marx's. And according to Bernstein, it's impossible to simply declare one's concepts right and the other wrong. Bernstein points to a dualism within Marx between the desire to approach the subject scientifically and the need to prove a theory. And so Marx's diagnosis, according to Bernstein, Marx's diagnosis of the problem is sound, but his prescription for the emancipation of the working classes becomes increasingly uncertain and unreliable because Marx's thought necessarily has to become more and more speculative. It thus appears that this great scientific spirit was in the end a slave to doctrine. And what does he mean? He's basically saying that Marx's Hegelianism holds back and undermines his commitment to scientific, to critical thinking. And so this is a great quote, where scaffolding put in place limits the way the building, limits the way of the building. He changed the building itself at the cost of its right proportions, and so made it all the more dependent on the scaffolding. And again, what he's talking about there is Hegelianism. Increasingly, he argues that many aspects of Marxism are falsified by the facts. And he responds to Kautsky's criticism. Karl Kautsky, pictured on this slide, is not Sigmund Freud. He looks a lot like him, but he is in fact Karl Kautsky, who was a Czech Austrian Marxist philosopher and a colleague and sometime rival of Bernstein in the Social Democratic Party. He helped found a socialist party in Austria, and like many German and Russian socialists of that period, spent a great deal of time in exile in Switzerland. Like Bernstein, he fell into the gradualist school of socialism and defended but nevertheless defended orthodox Marxism against Bernstein's revisionism. At some point, he also criticized the Spartacist revolutionaries like Rosa Luxemburg, and was a lifelong critic of the Russian Marxists, especially Vladimir Lenin. And so, he talks about the idea, Kautsky at one point rejects this idea that people are getting wealthier, which is a contradiction within Marx's predictions. At one point, Kautsky rejected Bernstein's empirical observation and argued that if that were true, that the men of our victory, that the date of our victory would not only be very long postponed, but we should never attain our goal. If it be capitalists who increase and not those with no possessions, then we are going ever further from our goal, and ever more evolution progresses. Then capitalism grows stronger, not socialism. In essence, what he's saying is we have to be hoping for things to be worse for the working class. We have to be rooting for the working class to become immiserated. And if there's any evidence to the contrary, we don't want to hear it. And we're getting back to this idea of the ethics, right? When the means corrupt the ends. He talks about this contrast between legislative pathways versus revolution. And he makes the point, where revolutions sin by overhaste, the everyday legislator sins by procrastination. And he talked about the working classes of his day, arguing that they lack the economic organization and educational capacity to undertake the overthrow of the capitalist order. This is a famous quote from Bernstein. One has not overcome utopianism if one assumes that there is in the present what is to be in the future. We have to take working men as they are. The proletariat has not been immiserated, but neither are they free of the prejudices and weaknesses that deny them revolutionary class consciousness. And so in essence, he's arguing that these guys, that these folks trying to foment revolutions are, to again coin a Marxist phrase, they are alchemists of revolution. This is a phrase that Marx deployed in a series of pamphlets criticizing rival socialists like Karl Schapper and August Willich, who favored small-scale revolts and strikes designed to seize state institutions and redistribute what resources they could to workers. For Marx, these reflected the idea that violence, in localized senses, were both misdirected and counterproductive. It actually strengthens the state by undermining the legitimacy of working class organizing efforts. And so Bernstein says we cannot make a Philistine out of a proletarian. And here again, Bernstein is arguing that revolutionary socialists are ignoring workers' tangible interests and are closed-minded in their doctrinaire application of Engels' more dogmatically interpreted Marxism. Another great quote, we cannot demand from a class the great majority of whose members live under crowded conditions, are badly educated, and have an uncertain and insufficient income, the high intellectual and moral standard which the organization and the existence of a socialist community presupposed. We will therefore not subscribe it to them by way of fiction. And again, he's basically saying, you want to get revolutionary class consciousness? Well, you better make sure that the proletariat actually has the wisdom to know what they need to do. And so from here we move to another very important topic, which is Soviet Marxist-Leninism. And this was, Russia's uniquely unforgiving political environment. Remember, you have an absolutist monarch in power at this point, the Tsar. They had been in power the Tsars had been in power for a very long time. They were the most backward of the kind of European countries, and really Russia is more, most of Russia actually is in Asia. But it ends up producing this particularly virulent strain of Marxist ideology. And first we have to note, that there was a very vibrant anarchist movement within Russia. If you look at this slide, the Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, who was, again, a contemporary of Marx, like most German and Russian socialists of this era. He spent much of his life in exile. He had been tried and sentenced to death for his role in the 1848 insurrections in Prague, which is now in the Czech Republic. He was a major rival of Karl Marx. Bakunin accused Marx of harboring authoritarian tendencies. And Marx, in turn, had Bakunin and the entire anarchist faction ejected from the First International, which was a gathering of socialist international organizations that was held at The Hague in the Netherlands in 1872. And so the anarchists are a really radicalized bunch, and one of the more important ones is a follower of Bakunin, who was his name was Sergei Nechayev, who famously wrote The Catechism of a Revolutionary. Nechayev was a fanatical follower of Bakunin, whose writings called for the complete subsumation of the individual to the cause. He was an advocate of indiscriminate terrorism. And his writings inspired many of the terrorist organizations of the 1960s. Marx and Engels derided Nechayev's fanaticism as a kind of barracks communism, characterizing it as authoritarian collectivism. So when Marx calls you an authoritarian, he's saying something. Nechayev was ultimately imprisoned by the Russians and died in the infamous Peter and Paul Fortress outside of St. Petersburg in 1882. And so beyond that, you have the Russian context. And again, pictured on this slide is a Russian Marxist by the name of Georgy Plekhanov. He is considered by many to be the father of Russian Marxism. Plekhanov was converted to Marxism in the 1880s while in exile from Russia, following a split within the Russian dissident movement. He formed the Emancipation Labor Group with fellow exiled Russians in Switzerland. Plekhanov sharply criticized Bernstein's revisionist interpretations of Marxism, and his writings were highly influential with second-generation Russian Marxists like Lenin. And so Marx, let's keep in mind, Marx didn't think that socialism would have much prospect of success in either the United States or in Russia for different reasons. In the United States, he really looked at American political culture and the individualism, the absence of feudal, kind of political arrangements, and basically said this is a purely distilled capitalism. It's highly unlikely that the United States would provide fertile soil for socialism. In the same way, he didn't think that Russia had much of a chance either. But in that sense, it was because, basically he looked at Russian politics and saw just a bunch of serfs. There was really not much of a proletariat in Russia at that time. A very small, kind of industry. And so you have to remember from the Communist Manifesto, when he talks about the movement of workers into the cities, sparing the workers the idiocy of rural life. He looked at agrarian societies as simply kind of a incestuous squalor. Nevertheless, within Russian intellectual thought, there was an enormously a great deal of valorization of the Russian peasantry, and that's mostly coming from a group that were known as the Narodniks. These were Russian intellectuals and reformers of the 1860s and 1870s. Their basic political motivations were the overthrow of the Russian monarchy, the czars, and an extensive land redistribution to the Russian peasantry, for whom the Narodniks felt a strong sense of almost mystified, romanticized affection. And so because of their valorization of the Russian peasantry, they were ambivalent regarding capitalism, believing instead in the establishment of an agrarian republic. And one branch of the Narodniks adopted a more anarchist bent, I'll give you more on in a little bit. But the other branch came to believe in the strategy of circulating among the Russian peasantry and engaging in consciousness raising. Now, these city-dwelling intellectuals that were oftentimes dressed in ways that were odd to the Russian peasants quickly inspired their suspicion and were oftentimes turned over to Okhrana, which was the Tsarist secret police. So they were very quickly identified and arrested. Well, again, that further kind of radicalized Russian intellectuals of this period. And it was within this environment that Vladimir Lenin kind of begins to emerge. He was born Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov in 1856. He was born into a middle-class Russian family in Eastern Russia that had some kind of ties to nobility, apparently. The assassination of Alexander II in 1883 resulted in a brutal crackdown and just massive expansion of police coercion, of secret police under Alexander III. Under Alexander III, you had the execution of Lenin's brother Alexander Ulyanov in 1887, and subsequently Ulyanov began to read in more radical, kind of circles. Travel in more radical circles. He was introduced and converted to Marxism via Plekhanov's writings in 1890. And in 1901, he adopts the nom de guerre of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. And so the meaning of Lenin is subject to some dispute. Some believe that Lenin is reference to a river in Siberia that symbolizes resilience and renewal. Some argue that it was simply a name on a forged passport that Ulyanov used to leave Russia, and that he just continued using it out of convenience's sake. So Lenin's Marxism is a particularly kind of brutal version. He was relentless in his belief that Marxists had to sharpen the contradictions. That was a phrase that he meant to exploit, use class conflict as a wedge issue towards the achievement of revolutionary ends. Lenin was unapologetically Machiavellian in believing that the revolutionary ends justify pretty much any means. Lenin expressed extreme contempt for revisionists like Bernstein. He would say that promises are like pie crusts made to be broken. Lenin he loved music, but suppressed it because it makes you want to be kind, and he believed he had to be hard to achieve these revolutionary ends. So Lenin's lack of sentiment was reflected in his struggles for leadership position. He was, again, fairly ruthless. One of the main conflicts was between what would become known the Bolshevik and the Menshevik factions within Russian socialism. And if you look at this slide, pictured on this slide is Pavel Axelrod. He was originally a follower of the anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, who I mentioned earlier. Axelrod spent time in Germany and was impressed by the organizational strength of the Social Democratic Party and wanted to pattern Russian socialism after the SDP. However, the Mensheviks lost out in the organizational struggles within the Russian workers' movement, and the party was eventually outlawed following the Russian Revolution of 1917. You nevertheless continued to have pockets of Menshevikism that persisted in certain regions, particularly in Georgia, and that became a justification for the brutal purges and the kind of mass famine that Stalin inflicted on Georgia and ultimately on Ukraine and Moldova as well. So Lenin insisted on a small, highly organized, conspiratorial party that was comprised of people who were dedicated and doctrinally sound, is sort of the phrase he would use. They ironically labeled that faction the Bolsheviks, which in Russian meant majority. In contrast, the Mensheviks advocated a broad-based, multi-ethnic party organized to move the country in a democratic direction. And so one of the things that Marx had very little use for is the idea of trade union consciousness. And he attacked this problem of, again, establishing and maintaining revolutionary class consciousness. So for Marx, the problem was that the proletariat on their own could not get past that level of trade union consciousness. And so the problem with trade union consciousness is that it deluded workers into believing that capitalism was capable of reform and improvement. And so as a result, Lenin advocated the use of a vanguard party. And again, Lenin expressed extraordinary contempt for reformers and their failure to sharpen the contradictions. He felt like you needed a vanguard party, again, comprised of intellectuals with a purity of vision. This sounds a lot like some versions of conservatism too, though, doesn't it? Doesn't it kind of echo Patrick Deneen's argument for an Aristoi, a group of people with purity of vision? So in his view, the vanguard will discipline the proletariat and herd them in a direction of revolutionary class consciousness and toward a classless society. Another feature of Lenin's version of Marxism is the belief in democratic centralism. Internally, the vanguard party would be a microcosm of the Democratic Party of the future, which was, again, a classless society. You would have free discussion that would encourage full deliberation, but once a decision was reached, the party coalesced and unified around that position. So in that sense, democracy was not feasible broadly because the masses could not be trusted to perceive their true interests. So again, it required this party, this group of people who were all doctrinally sound, to tell people what their interests were. No coercion there, right? A last concept that Engels, or that Lenin significantly contributes to Marxist terminology is the idea of imperialism. So Lenin asked the question, why did Europe's working class willingly participate in World War I? Keep in mind, most socialists tried to persuade workers to refuse military service, arguing that it was a rich man's war but a poor man's fight. Lenin's response to that question is imperialism, which was, in his view, the highest stage of capitalism. And in essence, what he is arguing is that European workers had been bought off. And so again, for Lenin, this idea of imperialism represents a kind of saving maneuver for capitalism. And so there are four conclusions that Lenin reaches, and I'll talk more about Leninism in a minute. But in his analysis, he's basically saying, first, the revisionists are no good. Second, the workers of developed nations have been infected with trade union consciousness on many, and took on many bourgeois-like attitudes. Third, the Communist Party must play the indispensable role of the vanguard, raising the consciousness of the proletariat, showing them the way, and disciplining them when necessary. And finally, Lenin predicted that the socialist revolution Marx predicted would not occur in developed countries like Europe or the United States, but rather in an economically backward nation like Russia or China. So let's talk a little bit about Marx and revisionism. So Marxism engagement, this is kind of an interesting he's offering a historiography of Marxism as an ideology within socialism. And so he offers this chronology. He says Marx and Engels engaged within socialist circles, beginning with the young Hegelians in the 1840s and the followers of Pierre Proudhon in the late 1840s. In the 1860s, Marx and Engels began to organize European workers' parties having to deal with anarchists like Bakunin. In the 1870s, Lenin mentions a couple of minor figures like Eugene Düring, a German socialist who was harshly critical of Marx in the 1870s, a period when Marx's health was rapidly deteriorating. And it fell to Engels to respond to the threat posed by Düring, and that resulted in the publication of Anti-Düring in a series of articles published in the main socialist newspaper in 1877 and 1878. Lenin has contempt for people who go back to earlier liberal ways of thinking. He is contemptuous in his use of the phrase, the professors. In essence, he's deriding Bernstein as an intellectual of sorts and not as a revolutionary thinker. There is the repetition of banalities of priests against materialism, which Lenin argues is simply them keeping their earning their keep by sidling up to the bourgeoisie. He says that we don't even have to think about these things. He's committing a kind of logical fallacy. It's called argumentum ad lapidem, appeal to stone, where the person states, that's ridiculous, I don't have to explain why. He criticizes the revisionists on economic development. He's basically saying what they're pointing to are anecdotes. We're not looking at the larger picture. And so for Lenin, the revisionist scientific sin involves ignoring the forest for the trees. Lenin accuses revisionists like Bernstein of grabbing superficial and one-sided generalizations, and in doing so urging on the peasant to take on the view of the bourgeoisie rather than the view of the revolutionary proletariat. And so for Lenin, Marx's predictions remain scientifically valid. They may simply have to be extended out a little bit. Again, Lenin dismisses the revisionists as offering nothing new or novel. Lenin expresses contempt for democracy. He argues that the liberals' claim that bourgeois parliamentarian will destroy class divisions is misguided. Parliamentarism does not eliminate but lays bare the essence of the most democratic bourgeois republics as organs of class oppression. Engagement with the morass of democratic politics is to blunt the consciousness of workers. Famous quote from Lenin, freedom in capitalist society always remains about the same as it was in ancient Greek republics. Freedom for slaveholders. And so again, these ideological fights for Lenin against revisionism are simply a prelude to the much more consequential ideological wars of the proletariat, which according to Lenin is marching toward the complete victory of the cause despite all the vacillations and weaknesses of the petty bourgeoisie. An important concept for Lenin to understand is this idea of imperialism. And again, that's increasingly the evolution towards a parasitic form of capitalism. Monopolies, oligarchy, and the striving for dominance rather than the striving for freedom. The exploitation of an increasing number of small or weak states by the handful of the richest and most powerful nations. Basically involve what he describes as a kind of rentier state. And if you don't know what a rentier state is, it's basically a state that gets itself involved in the economy and is basically just taking money out. Some people would say that taxation is a form of rentureship, and I don't agree with that. But tariffs might be, especially if you're using them in wildly irresponsible ways. So Lenin argues it would be a mistake to believe that this tendency to decay precludes the rapid growth of capitalism. Imperialism is simply a phase Marx didn't see. Right? So in essence, he's saying, Marx wasn't omniscient, but the revolutionary sequence is still solid. We just have to add a couple of spots in. State and revolution. The elimination of the state also entails the elimination of democracy. For Lenin, democracy is a state that acknowledges the subordination of the minority to the majority. Socialist goals must be the elimination of the state. People must be habituated to governing without resorting to force and to subordination. Ask yourself where the guns are going to go. I mean, that's always the question, right? Where does the coercive power of the state go if you get rid of the coercive institutions of the state? Are they just going to go out to the people? Or are some people going to use what remains of their institutions for their own personal ends? The economic basis of the withering away of the state. Lenin is convinced the state will eventually wither away. He makes reference to Marx's critique of the Gotha program. In Marx, there is not a shadow of the attempt to construct utopias and vainly guess about what cannot be known. There, I flatly disagree with him. I honestly do believe there's a lot of utopianism, even as he's calling other people's utopians. Remember I talked about that yada yada effect, right? Revolutionary class consciousness, how do we get to that point? Yada yada, it just happens. Channeling Marx, Lenin declares that contemporary society is a capitalist society, while contemporary state changes with each border. Therefore, the contemporary state is a fiction because it is not univariate across state borders. How will the state be changed by communism? Lenin asks, what social functions will remain that are analogous to state functions? For Lenin, this question can only be answered scientifically, and regardless of how many thousands of times the word people is combined with the word state, this will not bring us the smallest bit closer to its resolution. In other words, we don't know. We'll have to just figure it out. And he did figure it out when he seized the state. He took stuff. He killed people. He ordered the Red Terror. There were horrible things that happened in Lenin's name in the late 19 teens and early 20s. Merely a century ago. So he argues for a special stage or special phase of transition from capitalism to communism. And again, he is contemptuous of the idea of any kind of democratic transition. Lenin, for him, capitalist democracy, it's democracy for a paltry minority, democracy for the rich. And he cites Marx again, who captures the essence of capitalist democracy with this quotation: "The oppressed are allowed every few years to decide which particular representative of the oppressing class shall represent and repress them in Parliament." Lenin argues that the dictatorship is required to break the resistance of the capitalist exploiters. Once the resistance ceases, the need for repression will evaporate, and with it the state. Just think about the early 20th century and how many people had to evaporate. In essence, what happened in Russia, in China, in North Korea, in Vietnam, and elsewhere, in Cuba to some extent, is that when Marxists took over, they killed a lot of people who they viewed as immediate threats to their political rule. And that's, again, what happens when you allow one group of people to act with impunity. When you give them impunity to act, they will be ruthless in the assertion of their power. They will remove themselves from any sort of public accountability. They will kill their way to absolute control over government. And that's what we're going to discover in our next presentation, where we would begin talking about Russia after Lenin, and subsequently in China and other places. And then we'll kind of work our way through to socialism today. Where socialism continues to have some relevance. I'll see you next time.